I've been noticing that a lot of you study the topics that I talk about in school, which is nice. And some of you have told me that I've been helping you out with projects, with research, and just getting you interested in history. And that's also nice to hear. But I kind of do want to talk about things that you maybe haven't heard about before. And I think that this week I get to do just that. I suppose not many of you are from Canada like me. And that's actually great because that means that you've probably never heard about the history of Canada. Although Canada has about 10% the population of the United States, it does share a lot of its history, and trust me, it's going to be interesting. Welcome to Vlogs of Knowledge. Canada, like pretty much all of the American continent, originated as a European colony. The British, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese all sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to try to colonize this new continent, and you can obviously imagine the war and chaos that must have came out of that. This topic is kind of long and really can't be covered in just one video. I mean, Canada started out with the indigenous people, then became a French colony, then was taken over by the British, was involved in the American Revolution, and even the American Civil War. Like, for this reason, I'm going to split this video into two parts. This first video will cover Canada's history from the beginning of time all the way up to the mid-18th century, when it was taken over by the British and formally became one of its many colonies. But as always, let's put all of this in historical context and get some background. If you look at the Canadian map, up at the top left, you'll notice that Alaska is pretty close to Russia. And I know Alaska is part of the United States, I just said Canadian map because it was easier to situate. Anyways, once upon a time, some thousands of years ago, all of Alaska was covered in ice. That meant that people could very well cross from Russia over to Alaska by the ice. It's what happened during the last ice age. And it's really how Canada's history began. These indigenous people were arguably the very first colonies of America, way before the Europeans or even the Vikings. Since at that time the ice age was still going on, people didn't really venture that much into Canada. You just couldn't. I mean, there was no way. Everything was covered in ice. You couldn't really build a settlement there. And because of that, people had no choice but to stay close to Alaska. Eventually, the ice melted and people were finally able to explore this vast piece of land that was to become crucial to the development of Europe and eventually the entire world. It's kind of similar to what happened in Africa. People had to wait for the ice to clear so that they could venture north or south. Over time, these indigenous people became what we call the American Indians. Now, they had developed into multiple tribes and factions, and even spread out all the way down to South America. It's really the reason that the Europeans found people there in the first place. We know that this continent was discovered as a result of Christopher Columbus's trips in 1492. So really, before that, the American Indians were kind of left alone peacefully undisturbed, without contact with the outside world. If only they knew that what was about to happen would drastically change their lives. Columbus himself made a few trips around the Caribbean area of this new continent, and he represented Spain because Spain was the one who was sponsoring his trips, and as a result, Spain became the very first major European power to settle and colonize the American continent. After the Spanish, a few years later in 1497, the English reached the continent and they reached the eastern coast of what was to become the United States. Now, their efforts were largely driven by the fact that they wanted a faster way to Asia by heading east. They firmly believed and hoped that one day they would reach that goal. Keep in mind that we still haven't talked about Canada. I'm really giving you the full background information on the American colonies, who colonized what, so that you can kind of understand how that all played into effect a few centuries later. I feel that I would lose you if I didn't explain all of this beforehand. Finally, in 1524, France started their efforts at colonizing. They sent a ship to navigate the area between Florida and Newfoundland to try to find a faster way to Asia. Really, everybody was looking for a faster way to Asia, but they just didn't know how big this continent would be. Now, to be fair, the Portuguese and the British already had some small colonies in the north part of the continent. The French were not the first ones to discover it, but neither the Portuguese nor the British made any efforts to preserve those colonies, so the territory was eventually taken over by the French. Portugal turned its efforts to Brazil, and the British to what was to eventually become called the 13 Colonies. So really, the northern part of the continent, the very cold and wet part, was left entirely to the French, and in 1534, Jacques Cartier officially claimed it for France by planting their flag. That region formally became known as Canada, and that was the start of 2 centuries of French rule. It wasn't that easy though. The very first attempts at colonization kind of failed because of extreme weather or just attacks by the local American Indians. I mean, they did come in their home and they kind of claimed it for themselves. Despite those failures, the French saw a lot of opportunity in Canada. For one, fishing had become very popular in parts of Newfoundland and along the St. Lawrence River, the river that would eventually connect Quebec and Montreal, the very 2 big settlements of that area. And the French, they call that whole territory la Nouvelle-France. The French and the others still had some sort of hope of finding Asia, but that kind of slowly changed when they realized that there were better things that they could do in that territory. For one, this was a great opportunity to bring Christianity to the indigenous people and really make followers of them. As the traditional system goes, you find non-believers, you convert them to religion, you assimilate them, and then you put them to work. That way you can grow your empire, you don't have to do any dirty work, and you can also pocket all of the profits. It was great motivation for France. As attractive as that was, it wasn't the biggest motivation. The biggest motivation was fur. The American Indians were heavy users of fur because of the freezing temperatures that we have here in Canada in winter. I mean, fur is like the only way to keep warm. And coincidentally, fur was becoming very popular in Europe at that time. And that's how the fur trade began. The French would make friends with the local tribes and they would buy fur from them. In exchange, they would give them guns, utensils, and cloths, and over time it became the main export of the American colonies. It was the only reason for any sort of expansion into Canada. As I briefly mentioned earlier, on the eastern part of Canada, we have a river that we call the St. Lawrence River. For any of you that watch my Quebec vlog, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a huge river that opens up in the Atlantic Ocean. By sea, it's like the best way to come into Canada. Most of the colonies from France were situated on that river between Quebec and Montreal. Now at first, these two were like settlements or even villages, but eventually they became major cities, and Quebec was to become the capital of la nouvelle-France. For like a good 2 centuries, France was kind of doing good in the New World. I mean, besides a few wars with the local Indians and some alliances that ended up making more enemies than friends, it was a slow but profitable process, although they had a little problem with their population. Compared with the British or the Spanish, who had like hundreds of thousands if not millions of colonists, France only had but a few thousand. The truth was that France wasn't so good at colonizing. They didn't manage to have the same success as the others did. Various attempts at increasing numbers were somewhat successful, such as when France's King Louis XIV sent about 800 women overseas to marry and have children. But ultimately, France was really lagging behind in terms of colonization, and they were only depending on the fur trade, which is never a good thing to do. You should never depend on just one thing. Fast forward a few decades in the 18th century, and the French colony was arguably at its peak. Its numbers had grown to like 16,000, it had established some trading agreements with the local Indians, and was using fur as its main export, accounting for like 80% of everything it sent out. It's really unfortunate that that was the peak of the French colony. Meanwhile, the British, who had the 13 colonies in the south, were actually in the millions of inhabitants, like they massively outnumbered the French. And that was to play a very important role in the 7 Years' War, which is coming up next. At this point, it's not a surprise that Britain, France, and Spain all went to war. I mean, were they really going to share that territory peacefully? Like, of course not. In the beginning they did because there was a lot of territory and there was a lot of room to expand, but as time went on, they started to run into each other. While I won't go into too much detail about these wars, you can research them on your own, I will talk a little bit about the main one, the 7 Years' War. Now, the 7 Year War was a big war between France and Britain that lasted from 1756 to 1763. And I only say France and Britain even though there were more countries involved because it's just the simplest way. Now, this wasn't really a war about the colonies, it was more a war about Europe. It involved every major power in Europe except the Ottoman Empire and even spanned 5 continents. Like, many territories took sides, and we eventually got like 2 main camps, the Kingdom of Britain and the Kingdom of France. It was a very complicated war involving many countries and many battles, and the details are for you to research. What's important for our purposes is the fact that Britain was stronger and that they eventually won, especially because of their navy. Britain's navy was just the best there was at the time, and that allowed them to win the war. The war was ended with the Treaty of Paris that was signed in 1763, and that was a huge win for Britain. For one, they took all of France's colonies except a few fishing spots in Newfoundland and effectively ended the French rule, and since Spain was also involved in the war, Britain also got some of its territory, mainly the state of Florida. So France was effectively removed from Canada and the territory was given over to the British. Now, this was the year 1763. There's still a few centuries to go, but that'll be for part 2 of this episode. I really hope that you've enjoyed this one. So here are my questions to you. First of all, I want to ask, have you heard about the story of Canada before? Because when I think about it, if you studied the history of the United States, then they might have talked about it because these things are kind of closely linked. So in the end, you might have heard about it. But anyways, it doesn't matter. What did you think of them trying so hard to find Asia? And what about the fur trade? I would love to know, so please leave me a comment, because I really want this to be a two-way thing and not just a show. I want this to be a conversation. And bonus points for you, if you leave a comment, you might get featured in next week's video as a fan of the week. As you know, and as I say at the end of every video, I haven't talked about everything, and the things that I did talk about, I haven't gone into too much detail. That's okay, that's actually done on purpose because I want you guys to go out and research on your own and maybe learn a thing or two. With that being said, my name has been Cosden. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next Wednesday.